We are on the last chapter, well, the last theme tonight. So it's been 23 or 24 videos we've done on this, is the themes of paradise. And today we're going to focus on the last thing, which Imam Ghazali in his Ihya, we've been sort of following the themes through the last chapter of the Ihya, which is remembrance of death. And Imam Ghazali seals off his whole magnum opus, the Ihya al-Uddin, the revival of the religious sciences, with hope in Allah. Because you read some of the stuff in the Ihya al-Uddin, you're like, crikey, how on earth am I going to get this going on in my life? And we have to realise that the issue we have often in our religion is that our religion calls us to ideals. It calls us to reach a certain level that's demanded of us, but at the same time that can make people feel really as if they're always lacking. It's very common in our religion, and in our communities, is that we can often feel judged. We felt required to meet a certain standard, and we never feel like we're meeting that standard. It's never good enough. And so we've got this balance between living our ideals and our reality. And we always have to sort of harness these two and integrate them and synthesize them, knowing that we have to strive. What's the metaphor here is we've got a horizon. There's a horizon that we're heading towards, which is very important. We need ideals in life because we need to have a direction, a comfort, that we're heading towards. But we have to also recognise that we will always fall short of that horizon. The ideal, you'll never meet the ideal. If you expect or say, when am I going to get there? The reality is you're never going to get there. But the fact is we need a trajectory that we're going towards so that we know what's right and wrong. We know what's expected of us so that we can have some clarity and guidance in our life. But at the same time, what I often say to people when they really beat themselves up about these things is we need the horizon, it's a blessing. But we also have to look back and see how many steps we've made. And that was a huge paradigm shift for me, because many years I was like, when am I going to get there? Pushing myself, not expecting more of myself. And I burnt myself out completely. And then when I just look back and say, hang on a minute, let's just look back and see how we're progressing, and you can say, moving forward, it gives you a bit of hope, and you actually can give yourself a little bit of the pat on the back and say, you're not as bad as you're making yourself out to be. And we need that balance. And it's these two sides of the coin, because there's always two sides of the coin. But what we usually, it's either one or the other, isn't it? And we need to have both of them in life. And so this is where we have this theme in the Quran and in our religion, is about focusing upon the compassion, the empathy and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Where Allah says in the Quran, this theme's throughout the Quran, but the most famous verses are وَرَحْمَتِي وَسِعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ, that my compassion, my mercy, my empathy, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remember, rahmah in Arabic its underlying meaning is this sense of the motherly love, that it's nurturing, providing, wanting wanting that child to prosper in life, wanting to be there for them and support them. This is the idea of mercy in Arabic. It encompasses all things. So everyone says, well, Jello, that's great. Allah's mercy's there, I can chill out now. Also being so hard on myself. But then there's always this balance. Then Allah says in the next part of this verse, وَسَأَكْتُبُهَا. Well, it's beautiful how Allah does this, because it makes it sort of conditional. And the condition of this is that I will ordain it or write it or prescribe it. But he uses the tool seen in Arabic, and seen often means near future. So it's coming, it's there, and it's on the horizon. It's gonna, you'll see it soon. I will write it, I will ordain it. What? The mercy, my mercy and my compassion, for those who yattaqoon, are in this constant state of taqwa. So what's that mean? What's taqwa mean fundamentally? It means you're looking beyond your own self and being aware of what someone else expects of you, which is the Almighty. You've got a broader perspective of life. You're not just focused in on yourself and what you're getting. You're always throwing it out there. And what's my relationship with the Almighty in this? Whoever has that sort of mindset, like how's these things, how am I in my life with the Almighty? When I do things, how's that impacting my relationship with the Almighty? That's the state of mind of someone who gains the compassion and the empathy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is really important, because as long as we can have that mindset that I want to please Allah, I'm going to fall short. There's no doubt you're going to fall short. But the fact that you've got that mentality that you want to do that, it shows that you're in the right stead. And you shouldn't be beating yourself up so much. But there's this challenge of I've got to move forward, but at the same time I've got to be easy on myself at the same time, and know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is there for me. In the name of another famous verse, Qul, say, ordering the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to say to the believers, Ya ibadi. This is an honorific title. When Allah uses ibad, it's always honorific. Oh, my slaves, in an honorific sense. It's praise. Who asrafu ala anfusihim. This is really sarf in Arabic is to expend too much, to go to excess. So those who are excessive on themselves, what that means is they basically beat themselves up. They're always expecting more and more and more and more and more of themselves. Oh, those people who do that to themselves, they basically crush their own selves. He says, La taqnatu. He says, don't have despair of Allah. Now, qunut in Arabic means really intense despair, whereby you just think, what's the point? And you just give up. Don't have this state with Allah. Don't la taqnatu min rahmatillah. Don't have qunut, this really intense despair of the compassion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His mercy. Why? Because without a doubt, Allah says, Inna Allah yaghfiru dhunuba jami'an. He forgives all sins. Now, dhunub's a really interesting word in Arabic, because them comes from a root that means something that leads to something that looks like it's going to lead to some broadness, but it actually it narrows, it makes your life narrow and leads you down. So someone thinks like this will be a good venture, it's easy, but that ease actually ends up becoming restrictive on you. So, classic example I can think of, I sell drugs on the street. It's an easy life. But long term, what does it do? It leads to narrowness and draws you down if you look in the long term. So Allah, and that's how we often feel with sins. Sins, we feel, my God, look, my life's constricted, it's getting narrow. I feel like I'm going down, not up. And Allah says He can cover up. Forgiveness in Arabic means to cover something from the consequences of something. So He can cover up the consequences of those entirely. Why? Innahu, without a doubt, He is most definitely the one who is all forgiving, the one that can compass and merciful. Now, forgiveness and mercy are usually always coupled. Why? Because you cover up the consequences of your sin. Because usually if we do something in life, it requires a consequence, doesn't it? There's always a response back. If I say to Zahid, how are you doing? There's a response back, isn't there? He says, I'm fine, how are you? There's this reciprocity between human beings. We expect that in relationships. If I do something for you, not in a greedy way, but usually, if you're in a relationship, if I do something for you, you expect some comeuppance for it at some time. If you never get anything back from someone, basically they never phone you, they never put any effort into the relationship, you grow tired of the relationship. Because as human beings we need reciprocity. Reciprocity is throughout Allah's creation. So if we do something, something happens, doesn't it? If I switch off in the car and fall a bit sleepy, then you expect you might have an accident. But Allah often doesn't, He covers up the consequences of those, that, like the reciprocity of the consequence or the effects of something. And that's what's going on fundamentally all the time. And then the Rahim, Allah's compassion, is that He gives you opportunities to grow from that. So He doesn't just forgive you, He opens up doors for new opportunities. And then finally Allah says, وَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ, whoever does something that's shameful, or he wrongs himself, then he seeks Allah's forgiveness, he will experience God as all forgiving and all merciful, or he will find Him. And so, as I said, we have these expectations, And then we also realise that we have to be connected to Allah's compassion, that we're always going to fall short in what we set ourselves to, and we've got to have these two with us. The wings of, as I said, the wings of fear and the wings of hope in life. You can't fly without them, and in the center, whoever has those two has the heart in the centre. He has his heart alive. And the Prophet ﷺ, he loved people to be optimistic. The Prophet ﷺ said, "It pleases me al-fa'l salih." Fa'l is to basically have a good opinion of Allah and have high hopes, hopes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He loved that, and he loved goodly words, he said. So the thing is, and Imam Ghazali at the end of the Ihya talks about all these shortcomings in the book. I've probably written something and I'm not even acting upon it. You know, I might have explained something incorrectly. And at the end of the book, he ponders upon all of these, and he says, but the Prophet ﷺ, I have hope in following his example. So the Prophet ﷺ, the problem in following the Prophet ﷺ, one is there's an ideal, isn't there? There's an expectation. Oh my God, how could I follow his example? But at the same time, it's just as you strive to do it within your capacity, that's when you gain the Prophet ﷺ's mercy and you gain a connection to him. So knowing that you will always fall short of the example of the Prophet ﷺ, but the fact that you try to implement some of it in your life or have a yearning to do so, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't fail you. Obviously, if we look at our own deeds, we will fall short and think that we're nothing. But when we know what we're connected to, the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah and His Messenger, you realise there's hope. And it's this oscillation between these two sides. When we in life, if we always want happiness or we always have sadness, things are always going to become stagnant. You need both. You need this oscillation back and forth, and that's how life is. It's this dance back and forth between times of loneliness, and then they shift, and then times of joy. Times of loneliness, times of sadness, then times of joy. We have to accept that that's the flux of life. And when we can just be with them and move through them, then we feel our vitality come back to us. When we expect things in a certain way and not to shift, then we struggle, then we get frustrated, then we get depressed. And that's why, Imam Junaid said, the believer goes through 40 different states in the day. He flies, he's fluid through these states and accepts what Allah places before him. Now, one of the first hadith here that the Prophet ﷺ brings, he says, verily, Allah Ta'ala, Most High, has 100 forms of compassion. And in this life, He's brought down just one in this world. 99, He's saved for the next world. يَتَعَاطَفُونَ وَبِهَا وَيَتَرَاحَمُونَ. He said, the fact that we feel a sense of compassion in this life is really beautiful. There's some versions of this hadith. He said, this mercy that Allah has placed in this world, it manifests in when a father feels some sort of compassion for his child. That's a manifestation, a reflection of God's mercy. When a bird tends to its chick, when a wild animal tends to its child, when the bird drinks from the water, or when the animal drinks from the water, he said these are all manifestations of Allah's compassion in this world. So when we feel that sort of stirring in the heart, know that we're connecting to Allah's compassion and His empathy and His mercy in this world. So, and it's to inculcate that. This is one of the manifestations of Allah's mercy. However, no matter how intense we feel that compassion in this world, it's nothing compared to what we'll be experiencing in the next world. 99 forms of it He's stored up, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the next world. He says, I've delayed 99 forms that I will show, that I will demonstrate and show to my servants on the day of resurrection, as the Prophet ﷺ relates in Muslim. In another hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ says, if the disbeliever were to know of what Allah holds in terms of compassion and mercy, he won't even despair of the garden. This is the intensity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy and compassion. And if the believer, again, notice this balance, and if the believer were to know what's with Allah in terms of punishment and chastisement, he would never feel safe from the fire. So we have to dance. It's this dance of feeling both sides of the yin and the yang, the jamal and the jalal. We have to have these two sides and experience the full spectrum of. This is really important. Is that if we turn away from the full spectrum of our experience, feelings and emotions. If we just want one, we don't want to feel that feeling. We want to feel this feeling. What ends up, you become short-sighted. You have like a stigma in your experience. It's just like with our eye. I just want to see long-sighted. I don't want to see short-sighted. What happens? It impairs your vision. Likewise, if we move away and we don't sit with the full spectrum of experiences, we lose our sense of well-being. And that's when people become disorientated in their emotions, and they're just their heads all over the place because they're not able to experience their full spectrum of feelings and emotions in their life. And so we have to. This is what our religion's all about: this oscillation, moving back and forth between the two sides of reality. Then the Prophet ﷺ said, "My ummah is a people that I have mercy upon them." He says, there will be no punishment on them in the next life. Innama, rather, their punishment is in this life through trials and tribulations and earthquakes and killing and balaya and tests that come upon them. He says that's what they've got in this life. And so we have to always contextualize things. We have to see we have struggles in this life. It doesn't mean we don't try to solve our problems. We don't say, Jello, I just got to take it because this is in this world. But part of the whole test is that Allah wants to see us strive to find a solution, but we also have to realize it's a reality. We can't be just living in bliss all the time, and this is part of life. Then the Prophet ﷺ says, "Lallahu." This is my favourite hadith, and this is the one that the Prophet ﷺ. This is the one that Imam Ghazali finishes on in Ihya Ulumuddin. He says, Allah most definitely is more merciful with his believing servant than a mother who has compassion for her child. This hadith was related when I think it was at the battle of with Ta'if, when the Muslims sieged Ta'if. Not Ta'if itself. This was before the Battle of Hunayn. At the Battle of Hunayn, when the captives of war were brought, a mother was separated from its young infant, and she ran and she grabbed the child. She just basically was oblivious to the armies around her, ran to the child, covered it, and breastfed the child. And then all the Sahaba were really touched by this. They saw the state of the mother. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, would you imagine this woman will cast her child into a fire? And then they said, no, she definitely wouldn't. He said, Allah is more merciful to his servants than this woman is to her child. This is a hadith of Muslim. Now when you can contextualize things like this, you're like, Then the Prophet ﷺ said, again, this is a really beautiful hadith, Ubadah ibn Samit. The Prophet ﷺ would narrate certain hadith to Sahaba. And if my memory serves me correct, I think this one was to Mu'adh ibn Jabal as well, is that the Prophet ﷺ told him a hadith and he said, don't tell anyone. Because they basically become too relaxed. And what was that? He says, whoever testifies that there is no God except Allah, and that the Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his messenger, Allah will forbid the hellfire to touch him. And that's the one, like, we can go to the lowest of the low, but if we hold on to La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, and we feel a sense of a sense of disappointment at ourselves of where we are, and we wish to change. If you die on that, that's the kenz, that's the trophy. And so it's really important people contextualize things, and not just like, come on, you got to do more. Think you're a Muslim, you haven't done this and you haven't done that and you haven't. This is not the way. This is then it was like in another hadith, if my memory serves me correct here, is Abu Darda. This is the hadith here. He says, even if he steals, even if he fornicates, even if he drinks, He said, you feel remorse over these things? It's not like, look at what Idris just said, let's go down to Bradford City Centre tonight then. But the idea is that we fall into these things. The fact that we hold on, we think this is not something that's acceptable. We recognise it's not acceptable, but we recognise our shortcomings. Abu Darda ran, he said, Mu'adh ibn Jabal is saying all these things. Is this true? The Prophet ﷺ, he said, is this true? He said to the Prophet. And the Prophet ﷺ said, yes. He says, are you sure? He's like, this is crazy. And he went, yes. He says, Mu'adh spoke the truth. Repeated 3 times. He says, whether you like it or not, Abu Darda, he says to him. And so, this is, as I said, this is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then, what else does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam relate from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? He said, this is now, if I've got my, let me just make sure I've related all the ones to that. Here. The Prophet ﷺ said, my hope is that 1/4 of the garden will be from those who follow me from my time. So the Prophet ﷺ said, the people went, Allahu Akbar. And then he said, no, actually, my hope is that they will be half of the people of the garden. He says, Allahu Akbar. Then he recited, ثُلَّةٌ مِّنَ الْأَوَّلِينَ وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنَ الْآخِرِينَ in Surah Al-Waqi'ah. He says there will be a large group from amongst the first and a few from amongst the last. And there's a difference of opinion. What does that mean? Does it mean there will be a large group from the early communities and then a small group from the last? Or does it mean a group from the first to enter paradise will be a large group and then the last will be few? My Lord, mighty and majestic, has promised to enter 70,000 of my people into the garden without reckoning. And then each 1,000 from those 70,000 will intercede for another 70,000. And then each 1,000 from amongst them will intercede for another 70,000. Then he says, then my Lord will take 3 handfuls with his hand. Imagine this is an expression of Allah's basically command. Is that from his mercy he takes 3 scoops into the hellfire, and then he will cast them into the garden. On this is one of my favourite hadiths as well. He said, almost said like he basically lost it. He went, Allahu Akbar. He said basically all that, and then think how large Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those scoops will be from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says God is able to enter all the people of the earth in just 1 scoop. And then the Prophet ﷺ, that was what Umar said. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, Umar has spoken truly. Now on the day of judgment, what will be the manifestation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy? He says, Jabir ibn Abdullah said, anyone whose good outweighs their bad will enter the garden without any account. Whoever's are equal, he will be accounted for slightly on the day of judgment. Then the intercession of the Prophet ﷺ comes in. So obviously we're not talking about the major intercession, that's for all creation, where he lifts the sun coming down on the heads of the people on the day of judgment. He says, then the Prophet ﷺ comes in, and then the Prophet ﷺ says, my intercession is for the people of who committed grave deeds from amongst my ummah. One time Hudhayfa ibn Yamam heard a man saying, oh Allah, make me from amongst those who will be under the intercession of the Prophet ﷺ on the day. And he says, don't ask for that. He says, because that's for the people who will have major sins. He said, Allah will suffice the believers from this. This is for the sinful believers amongst the Muslims. It says in the hadith of Ibn Abi Shayba. A man from amongst the Muslims, the believers beseech God So then the intercession comes in. On the day of judgment, a man from the Muslims will stand before the creation on the day of resurrection. He'll be exposed amongst the people on the day of resurrection, and 99 scrolls will stretch out that record all his bad deeds as far as the eye can see. And Allah will ask him, do you deny any of this? Have my scribes wronged you in any way? And he says, no, my Lord. Do you have an excuse? He says, no, my Lord. Really? Allah's playing him now. He says, really? He says, have you not got one good deed? He says, you've got one good deed in my sight. And the man says, what is it? What is it? He says, you're not going to be wrong today, Allah says to him. Then a card will appear, and with it on it says, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. He said, what will this card serve me with all these scrolls? And Allah says to him, you shall not be wronged. The scroll shall be put on one pan, and this card will be put on the other, and it completely basically flips the pan, and just la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. And then this is so beautiful, the end of this is the hadith. He says, فَلَا يَثْقَرُ مَعَ اسْمِ اللَّهِ شَيْءٍ. He says nothing can outweigh the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, because you're talking about the absolute. So everything diminishes when you're in the eyes of when you're gazing upon the absolute. Then what happens? The believers beseech God to deliver their brothers. So when the people enter the garden, they will spit. They say, we don't see so and so here. They said they used to fast and pray and perform Hajj with us, and they will be told to leave the fire. Some leave the fire who have fire up to their shins, some up to their legs, and so forth and so forth. And some use this as an argument, this hadith like this, to say this is a proof. Allah knows best. Is that the Prophet's uncle Abu Talib is in paradise because eventually, because it says that the fire touches the Prophet also made a dua for him to move him up to a higher stage of the hellfire where just his feet were burned. And this, they say, this is the stage of where the believers are, because they won't experience the punishment of the fire fully, so he must be in the stage of those people who will be interceded for. Well, Allah knows best. Then the angels will continue to intercede and go into the hell and expel the believers, bring the believers out, until they tell him there are none left. And then the prophets and the believers intercede too, until God will take a handful himself, and a handful from his own hand, who never did any good, and they're burnt like coal. And then he will cast them into the rivers of the garden, called the river of life. And they will emerge like seeds on the side of a flood. You know, when we sort of don't know if you saw this in Bradford, but Keighley, did you get hit by the floods, or these water that basically just between was it Steeton and Keighley, cars were just basically having to be abandoned. So when these waters flow, they knock over seeds onto the side of the banks near the rocks and the trees. And he said, the Prophet ﷺ said, these people will emerge like seeds on the side of a flood. Some of them will be like yellow and green from the sun, and some will be white in the shade. And then the Sahaba say, oh, Messenger of Allah, did you used to herd sheep in the countryside? They comment, because how do you know the details of these sorts of things? And of course he was. And they emerge like pearls around the river, and they will have rings around their necks. And the people of the garden will recognize them as those who have been emancipated, freed by the All-Merciful. And he enters them into the garden without any act they carried out, or any good that they actually can present. And God says, enter the garden, and whatever you see is yours, he says to these people. So eventually they're entered out from the hellfire, and he says, enter the garden, and whatever you see is yours. O Lord, grant us what no one in this world has been granted. You'll have better than that, Allah says. And they said, what can that be? He says, my pleasure, I will never be angry with you ever again. So this proves that the connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala overrides all of paradise, and being disconnected from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hellfire is the greatest punishment that people experience. This is a hadith of Bukhari and Muslim. Then it says, 2 men will be brought out of the fire on the day of standing, and God will say to them, this is what your hands have brought on you. It says, and I do not oppress or wrong any of my slaves. So they're basically brought forward to be an example of. I say, how have you found your time? They said, it's been awful. They say, these 2 people. Then he will command, he says, take them back to the fire. And he says, one of them rushes back to the fire, and the other one, he sort of dilly-dallies, and he looks back like this. And Allah basically said, he calls them back, and he says, what made you act like the way you did? So he asks both of the parties, why did you rush back, and why did you dilly-dally and look back? And the first will say, I was fearful of the repercussions of my sins, and I did not want to expose myself to your anger a second time. That's the first one. The second one says, I stalled because I have a good opinion of you, and I sense that you would not send me back after you brought me out. And Allah says both of them were entered into the garden. So it's this attitude. That's the most important thing. It's our attitude with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet Tirmidhi relates in another hadith, take out of the fire anyone who remembered me for a day or feared my station. The Muslims whose bad deeds outweigh their good deeds will be in the company of the disbelievers in hell, and they will taunt them. So those whose bad deeds outweigh their good deeds, they will be entered into the hell, and the disbelievers will taunt them. They say, hey, what did your religion do for you? You're down here with us. And they say, were you not Muslims? Did your Islam not benefit you whatsoever? And they will say, we had sins, so we were taken to account. And he says, then God hears this and says, take them out immediately. And he says, and then they say, then the disbelievers say, alas, if only we were Muslims, so we could leave with them. And this goes to the verse in the Quran in Surah Hijr, where the Prophet he recited then this verse, ربما يود الذين كفروا لو كانوا مسلمين. Those who disbelieve, they wish that they were Muslims at this time. So in order to show the honour of the believers, no matter what their state, they will eventually be taken out. And I said, this is when the intercession happens, when the angels and the prophets and the believers intercede on the behalf of the believers that are in the hellfire. So when we read these sorts of things, we realise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is great. And what's really important here is that we have this balance. We push, we expect ourselves, we try to achieve things, but we realise that we will always feel short. And so we have this balance between praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also of pondering upon our shortcomings, but knowing that as long as we have the right attitude, we're trying to go towards a trajectory, Allah will never fail us, and our eventual abode will be the paradise. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us. So Imam Ghazali finishes the whole ihya on this point, the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think it's a really important reflection for us in these times, because sometimes we try to burn ourselves out and expect more from ourselves, and Allah knows our time. He knows what time we live in. He knows our situations, and we have to be mindful of that and not just focus on ourselves and what we should be doing, because then it becomes a subtle element of shirk, because you're looking at like as if you can do anything. All Allah expects from you is you try, and then you leave the rest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you seek out guidance about how you can move forward in your life. But in the end, Allah's mercy is great.